The Roswell Incident, a dramatized documentary narrative. Chapter 1. The Storm Before the Calm. The summer of 1947 stretched across New Mexico like a fever dream. Heat waves danced off the desert floor, creating mirages that seemed to mock reality itself. In the small town of Roswell, population barely scraping 8,000, ranchers went about their daily routines under a sky that seemed different somehow. Bigger, more watchful. Mac Brazel had seen plenty of storms in his 48 years. The kind that rolled across the high desert with all the fury of an angry god, leaving behind twisted metal, broken fence posts, and the occasional dead cow. But the storm that hit his ranch on July 2nd, 1947, was unlike anything he'd experienced. The lightning came in colors he'd never seen before. That night, as thunder echoed across the Chihuahuan desert, something fell from the heavens. Not rain, not hail, something else entirely. Mac would later tell reporters it sounded like the biggest explosion you ever heard. But when dawn broke over the Foster Ranch, 30 miles northwest of Roswell, there was no crater, no obvious impact site, just debris. Scattered across 3/4 of a mile of scrubland, the wreckage caught the morning sun like fragments of a broken mirror. Mac approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the hard-pan desert floor. What he found defied explanation. Metallic sticks, thin as kite struts but impossible to break. Foil-like material that couldn't be torn, burned, or dented. Strange symbols etched into beam-like structures. Mac picked up a piece of the metallic foil, no bigger than his palm. It felt weightless, almost alive somehow. When he crumpled it in his fist, it immediately returned to its original shape. Perfect, unblemished, as if his touch had never existed at all. What in the Sam Hill? He muttered to the empty desert. For 3 days, Mac left the debris where it lay. 3 days of riding out to check his fences, each time hoping the strange wreckage would somehow make sense. Each time returning more confused than before. Finally, on July 5th, he loaded some of the larger pieces into his pickup truck and drove into Roswell. The town sheriff, George Wilcox, had seen plenty of strange things in his years wearing a badge. Drunks claiming they'd seen pink elephants. Travelers swearing they'd spotted ghosts dancing along Highway 285. But when Mac Brazel walked into his office carrying what looked like pieces of a metallic jigsaw puzzle, Wilcox knew this was different. "Mac," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what exactly are you showing me here?" "Don't rightly know, George. Found it scattered all over my place after that storm Tuesday night. Figured you might have some ideas." Sheriff Wilcox picked up one of the beam-like pieces. Light as balsa wood, but with a metallic sheen that seemed to shift colors depending on the angle. Along its length, tiny symbols were etched with surgical precision. Not English, not Spanish, not anything he recognized from his time in the Pacific during the war. "You think it's some kind of experimental aircraft?" Wilcox asked. Mac shrugged. "Could be. Though I never seen metal like this before, and there's a lot more of it out there." That afternoon, Sheriff Wilcox made a phone call that would change everything. The Roswell Army Airfield sat just south of town, home to the 509th Bomb Group, the same unit that had dropped the atomic bombs on Japan just 2 years earlier. If anyone would know about experimental aircraft, it would be them. Major Jesse Marcel answered the phone on the third ring. "Marcel here. Major, this is Sheriff Wilcox in town. Got a rancher here with some debris he found after that storm Tuesday night. Wondering if it might be from one of your training exercises." There was a pause, long enough for Wilcox to wonder if the connection had gone dead. "What kind of debris, Sheriff?" "Well, that's just it. We're not exactly sure. Metal pieces, but unlike anything we've seen. Thought you might want to take a look." Another pause. "We'll be right there." Major Marcel hung up the phone and stared out the window of his office at the vast New Mexico sky. In the distance, a single cloud drifted lazily toward the mountains, innocent, peaceful. He had no way of knowing that the next 24 hours would thrust him into the center of the most enduring mystery in modern American history. No way of knowing that the debris sitting in Sheriff Wilcox's office would spark decades of conspiracy theories, government cover-ups, and endless speculation about what really happened in the desert that July night. As Marcel grabbed his keys and headed for the door, the desert wind picked up outside, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another storm. In Roswell, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Beautiful, almost otherworldly, the kind of sky that makes you believe anything is possible. Chapter 2. First Contact. The drive from Roswell Army Airfield to the sheriff's office took Major Jesse Marcel exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Marcel wasn't your average military officer. At 37, he'd already distinguished himself as the base intelligence officer, a man trusted with the military's most sensitive information. He'd seen classified aircraft, experimental weapons, technology that wouldn't be revealed to the public for decades. Nothing had prepared him for what waited in Sheriff Wilcox's office. The debris filled 2 large cardboard boxes and spilled onto the sheriff's desk, like pieces of an impossible puzzle. Marcel approached slowly, his trained eye cataloging each fragment. The metallic foil caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, reflecting it back in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics. "Sheriff Wilcox said you found this on your ranch?" Marcel asked Mac Brazel. "That's right, scattered across maybe 3/4 of a mile. This is just a small sample of what's out there." Marcel picked up one of the I-beam structures, examining the strange symbols etched along its surface. They looked almost hieroglyphic, but with a precision that suggested advanced manufacturing techniques. The beam itself felt impossibly light, yet when he tried to bend it, it remained perfectly rigid. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" Marcel asked. Mac shook his head. "Just the sheriff here. Figured the army would want to know about it." Marcel's mind raced. In his years of intelligence work, he'd developed an instinct for recognizing the truly significant from the merely unusual. Every fiber of his training screamed that this was significant, extraordinarily significant. "I'm going to need to see the crash site," Marcel said. "Tonight." As darkness fell over the New Mexico desert, Marcel followed Mac Brazel's pickup truck along a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. Their headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating sagebrush and the occasional startled jackrabbit. Above them, stars filled the sky with an intensity only possible in the high desert, far from the contaminating glow of city lights. When they reached the debris field, Marcel stepped out of his Jeep and into history. The wreckage stretched across the desert floor like a metallic constellation fallen to earth. In the beam of his flashlight, the debris seemed almost alive, catching and reflecting light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Marcel walked slowly through the field, collecting samples, his military bearing unable to mask his growing amazement. This wasn't from any aircraft he'd ever seen. Not American, not Russian, not from anywhere on Earth. The thought struck him like a physical blow. Marcel had spent his career dealing in facts, in evidence, in things that could be quantified and cataloged. But as he knelt in the New Mexico desert, holding pieces of material that defied every natural law he understood, a single, impossible conclusion began to form in his mind. We are not alone. Marcel spent 3 hours at the debris field, loading his Jeep with samples, while Mac Brazel watched in silence. The rancher had seen the expression on Marcel's face. The same look he'd worn for 3 days, staring at the impossible wreckage scattered across his land. The look of a man whose understanding of the universe had just been fundamentally altered. As they prepared to leave, Marcel took one last look around the crash site. Tomorrow he would return with a full recovery team. Every piece of debris would be collected, cataloged, and shipped away. The desert would be swept clean, as if nothing had ever happened. But tonight, under a canopy of stars that suddenly seemed less lonely, Major Jesse Marcel allowed himself to believe in the impossible. The drive back to base passed in contemplative silence. Marcel's mind churned with questions that had no easy answers. What was the debris? Where had it come from? And perhaps most importantly, what was he supposed to do about it? As intelligence officer, Marcel reported directly to Colonel William Blanchard, the base commander. A decorated war hero who'd flown bombing missions over Europe, Blanchard was known for his level-headed approach to problems and his absolute discretion with classified information. Marcel glanced at his watch. Nearly midnight. Too late to call Blanchard tonight, but first thing in the morning, he would have to brief the colonel on what they'd found. He would have to find words to describe the indescribable. As Marcel pulled through the gates of Roswell Army Airfield, the guard nodded respectfully. Just another night shift ending, another officer returning from routine duties. The guard had no way of knowing that in the back of Marcel's Jeep lay evidence that would challenge humanity's most fundamental assumptions about its place in the universe. Marcel parked in front of his quarters and sat for a moment in the darkness, engine ticking as it cooled. Through his windshield, the base looked exactly as it had when he'd left hours earlier. Same buildings, same personnel, same familiar routine of military life. But everything had changed. As Marcel carried the first box of debris into his quarters, a shooting star streaked across the sky above Roswell. Brief and brilliant, gone in an instant. Or maybe it wasn't a shooting star at all. Maybe it was something heading home. Chapter 3. The Machine in Motion. Dawn came early to Roswell Army Airfield on July 8, 1947. Before the sun had fully cleared the eastern horizon, Major Marcel was already in Colonel Blanchard's office, boxes of debris at his feet, and a story that would test the limits of military protocol. Colonel William Blanchard had commanded men in wartime. He'd made decisions that affected thousands of lives, processed intelligence that could turn the tide of battles. But as Marcel laid out the strange metallic fragments on his desk, Blanchard found himself in uncharted territory. "You're telling me this fell from the sky?" Blanchard asked, holding up one of the beam-like structures. "That's what the evidence suggests, sir. The debris field is consistent with an aerial crash, but the material..." Marcel paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's unlike anything in our inventory." Blanchard examined the symbols etched into the beam. They seemed to shift and dance in the morning light, too precise to be natural, too alien to be terrestrial. In his years of military service, he'd learned to trust his officers, especially men like Marcel, who'd proven their competence time and again. "What's your assessment, Major?" Marcel met his commander's gaze. "Honestly, sir, I believe we're dealing with something not of this world." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything they'd been trained to believe. Blanchard set down the beam and walked to his window, looking out at the familiar landscape of the high desert. Somewhere out there, scattered across MacBrazel's ranch, lay the rest of this impossible puzzle. "I want a full recovery operation," Blanchard said finally. "Complete media blackout. This doesn't leave the base until we know what we're dealing with." Within hours, the machine was in motion. Trucks rolled out of Roswell Army Airfield carrying personnel who'd been given no explanation beyond classified recovery mission. Marcel led the convoy, his Jeep loaded with collection equipment and a growing sense that they were participating in something historically significant. The debris field looked different in daylight, less mysterious perhaps, but no less extraordinary. Under the harsh New Mexico sun, the metallic fragments created a pattern across the desert floor that resembled crop circles or ancient ritual sites. Deliberate, purposeful, as if the crash had been guided. Sergeant Louis Rickett had seen action in the Pacific. He'd walked beaches littered with the wreckage of war, collected intelligence from crashed Japanese aircraft. But as he moved through the debris field, carefully placing each fragment into collection bags, he felt like an archaeologist discovering artifacts from a civilization that shouldn't exist. "Sergeant," Marcel called out, "what do you make of this?" Rickett approached, wiping sweat from his forehead. Marcel was kneeling beside what appeared to be a larger section of hull material, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet. The surface was smooth as polished silver but warm to the touch, despite lying in the desert all night. "Looks like part of the main structure," Rickett said. "But I can't figure out how it's constructed. No rivets, no seams. It's like it was grown rather than built." Marcel nodded. He'd noticed the same thing. Every piece of debris, from the smallest fragment to the largest structural components, showed the same seamless construction, as if the entire craft had been formed from a single piece of material. The recovery operation continued throughout the morning. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, they erased the physical evidence of whatever had crashed in the New Mexico desert. By noon, Mac Brazel's ranch looked exactly as it had before the storm of July 2nd. Clean, normal, unremarkable. But the debris told a different story. Back at the base, Marcel supervised the cataloging process. Each fragment was photographed, measured, and assigned a classification number. The larger pieces filled an entire hangar, arranged on tables like an exhibition in some impossible museum. Major Marcel walked among the displays, trying to piece together the bigger picture. The craft had been roughly disc-shaped, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. Light construction, but incredibly strong. No visible propulsion system, no fuel tanks, no conventional aircraft components whatsoever. It was as if someone had taken the concept of flight and redesigned it from scratch. That afternoon, Colonel Blanchard made a decision that would reverberate through history. With the debris secured and the recovery complete, he authorized the base public information officer to release a statement to local media. Lieutenant Walter Haut had written dozens of press releases during his time at Roswell Army Airfield. Routine announcements about training exercises, personnel changes, community relations events. But when Colonel Blanchard walked into his office on the afternoon of July 8th, Haut knew this was different. "Walter," Blanchard said, closing the door behind him, "I need you to prepare a press release. We recovered a flying disc." Haut looked up from his typewriter, certain he'd misheard. "Sir?" "A flying disc. Crashed on a ranch near Roswell. We have it in our possession." The press release that Lieutenant Haut typed that afternoon would become one of the most famous documents in UFO history. Simple, direct, unambiguous. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday, when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chaves County. At 2:26 p.m. on July 8, 1947, Haut delivered copies of the press release to Roswell's 2 radio stations and the daily newspaper. Within hours, the story was racing around the world. Phone calls flooded into Roswell Army Airfield from reporters in New York, Los Angeles, London. The Associated Press picked up the story. Newspapers from coast to coast prepared headlines that would shake the foundations of human understanding. Army captures flying disc in New Mexico. Roswell Army finds crashed saucer. The impossible becomes reality. But in Washington, D.C., powerful men in dark suits were already reaching for their telephones, preparing to make the impossible disappear once more. The machine that had been set in motion was about to shift into reverse. Chapter 4. The Weight of Secrets. In Washington, D.C., the call came at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, was reviewing routine intelligence reports when his aide knocked on his door. "General, I have General McMullen on the line. Says it's urgent." General Clements McMullen commanded Strategic Air Command, the elite organization responsible for America's nuclear arsenal. When McMullen called, generals answered. "Ramey here. Roger, we have a situation developing at Roswell. Have you seen the press reports?" Through his window, General Ramey could see B-29 super fortresses lined up on the tarmac, their silver wings gleaming in the Texas sun. These were the aircraft that had ended World War II, the most sophisticated bombers in the American arsenal. Suddenly, they seemed primitive. "I've seen them," Ramey said carefully. That press release was unauthorized. Colonel Blanchard exceeded his authority. There was steel in McMullen's voice, the kind that ended careers and buried secrets. Ramey had served long enough to recognize the tone. This wasn't a request or a suggestion. This was an order wrapped in conversation. What do you need from me, General? Blanchard is shipping the debris to you for analysis. When it arrives, I want you to take a close look and issue a correction to the press. Make this go away, Roger. Make it go away completely. The line went dead. General Ramey sat in his office for several minutes, staring at the phone. In his 30 years of military service, he'd followed orders that sent men into battle. Orders that kept nuclear secrets from falling into enemy hands. Orders that protected national security in ways the public would never understand. This felt different. This felt like burying the truth. At Roswell Army Airfield, Major Marcel was preparing the debris for shipment when Colonel Blanchard pulled him aside. Jesse, I want you to personally escort this material to Fort Worth. General Ramey wants to see it firsthand. Marcel nodded, though something in Blanchard's expression suggested this wasn't routine procedure. Understood, sir. What about the press situation? Blanchard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's being handled at a higher level. That evening, Marcel loaded the most significant pieces of debris aboard a B-29 bound for Fort Worth. As the bomber lifted off from Roswell, Marcel watched the New Mexico desert fall away beneath them. Somewhere down there, Mac Brazel was probably having dinner with his family, unaware that his discovery had set in motion a chain of events that reached the highest levels of government. The flight to Fort Worth took 2 hours. Marcel spent the time studying the debris, trying to memorize every detail. He had a growing suspicion that once they landed, his direct involvement with the material would end. He was right. General Ramey met the aircraft personally, an unusual honor for a major. But as they walked toward the base headquarters, Marcel realized this wasn't about honor at all. Major, I understand you've had quite an adventure, Ramey said, his tone carefully neutral. Yes, sir. The debris is unlike anything I've encountered. I believe it represents technology far in advance of anything currently in our inventory. They reached Ramey's office, where several men in civilian clothes waited. No introductions were made, but Marcel recognized the type. Intelligence specialists. The kind of men who made problems disappear. Major Marcel, General Ramey said, settling behind his desk. I want you to take a look at this material and tell me what you see. Marcel followed Ramey's gesture to a table in the corner of the office. Scattered across its surface were pieces of metallic debris, twisted and burned. Standard aircraft wreckage. Conventional materials that could have come from any experimental balloon or test aircraft. Sir, this isn't what we recovered at Roswell. Are you certain, Major? It's been a long few days. Easy to get confused about details. The words were spoken gently, but Marcel heard the steel beneath them. The same steel that had been in General McMullen's voice hours earlier. This was how the military worked when it really wanted something. Not with threats or coercion, but with the subtle pressure that made resistance seem pointless. Major, one of the civilian specialists said, speaking for the first time. Let me explain what happened here. A classified military balloon crashed on that ranch. High-altitude weather monitoring equipment. Very sensitive, which is why we needed to recover it quickly. Marcel looked at the conventional debris on the table, then back at the men watching him with patient eyes. In that moment, he understood the choice he was being asked to make. Tell the truth and end his career, possibly face charges for compromising classified information. Or accept the official explanation and help bury the most significant discovery in human history. The weather balloon explanation makes sense, Marcel heard himself saying. That would account for the unusual radar reflectors and metallic components. General Ramey smiled. Exactly. Now, Major, I believe some reporters are waiting outside. They'll want to hear your assessment of the debris. The press conference lasted 20 minutes. Marcel found himself standing beside General Ramey, looking down at the conventional aircraft wreckage while cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. He answered their questions with the mechanical precision of a man following a script he'd never seen before. "The material appears to be from a high-altitude surveillance balloon," he told the assembled press. "Quite sophisticated, but definitely terrestrial in origin." The reporter seemed satisfied. A weather balloon was prosaic enough to be believable, classified enough to explain the initial secrecy. By evening, newspapers across the country were printing retractions. Roswell flying disc, identified as weather balloon. Army explains mysterious New Mexico debris. Flying saucer story deflated. But that night, alone in his quarters at Fort Worth, Marcel stared at the ceiling and wondered what had happened to the real debris. The material that defied physics, that bore symbols from no earthly civilization, that represented proof humanity was not alone in the universe. Somewhere in the labyrinthine depths of military bureaucracy, that proof was disappearing into filing cabinets marked with classifications beyond his security clearance. Men in dark suits would study it, catalog it, and eventually lock it away where it could never threaten the comfortable assumptions that kept civilization stable. Marcel had spent his career protecting secrets. Now he was part of one. Outside his window, stars filled the Texas sky with the same brilliant intensity he'd seen over New Mexico. But they no longer seemed distant and unreachable. They seemed like destinations on a map he wasn't allowed to read. In Roswell, Mac Brazel was learning the weight of secrets as well. 2 days after the press conference, military personnel visited his ranch again. Not to recover more debris, but to ensure his continued silence. The conversation was polite but unmistakable in its implications. Mac's cooperation would be remembered and rewarded. His failure to cooperate would be equally memorable. Mac Brazel, who'd spent his life dealing with the harsh realities of ranching in the desert, understood perfectly. He would never speak publicly about what he'd found in his fields again. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Desert. The desert remembers everything. 2 weeks after the world's attention had moved on from Roswell, after the newspapers had buried the story beneath reports of international tensions and domestic politics, Mac Brazel sat on his porch watching the sun set over land that looked exactly as it had before July 2, 1947. But everything was different now. The military men had been thorough. They'd returned to his ranch 3 more times, using metal detectors and methodical search patterns to locate every fragment of debris. They'd even sifted the soil in some areas, ensuring nothing remained that might contradict the weather balloon explanation. Mac watched his cattle move slowly toward the water tank, their bells creating a lonely melody in the evening air. Simple creatures living simple lives, unburdened by knowledge of things beyond their understanding. He envied them. The financial compensation had been generous. More money than Mac had seen in 20 years of ranching, enough to repair fences, upgrade equipment, maybe even take a vacation somewhere far from the New Mexico desert. But the money came with strings attached. Invisible strings that bound him to silence more effectively than any legal document. Mac had signed papers, of course, documents that classified his discovery under the National Security Act, that made any future discussion of the incident a federal crime. But beyond the legal obligations, there was something else. A weight that settled on his shoulders like desert dust, accumulating day by day. The knowledge that he'd been part of something extraordinary. Something that would remain buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and official denial. 300 miles east of Roswell, in Fort Worth, Texas, Major Jesse Marcel was learning to live with his own burden. His debriefing had been thorough and final. The real debris had been shipped to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where specialists with higher security clearances would study it in laboratories he would never see. Marcel's role in the incident was officially over, but late at night, when his family was sleeping and the base was quiet, Marcel found himself sketching from memory. The strange symbols he'd seen etched into the beam-like structures, the impossible properties of the metallic foil, details that seemed to fade a little more each day, as if his mind was protecting itself by forgetting. He'd filled an entire notebook with these sketches, hiding it in a locked drawer in his desk. A secret record of humanity's first confirmed contact with technology from another world. Evidence that would mean nothing to anyone but himself, but that felt essential to preserve. Proof that he hadn't imagined it all. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, in underground facilities that didn't appear on any public maps, teams of scientists were indeed studying the Roswell debris. Metallurgists, physicists, engineers, the brightest minds the military could assemble, working around the clock to understand materials that seemed to violate fundamental laws of science. Dr. Sarah Chen had spent the war years developing radar systems, work that had given the Allies a crucial advantage in detecting enemy aircraft. But as she examined fragments of the Roswell debris under electron microscopy, she felt like a medieval alchemist trying to understand nuclear physics. The molecular structure was unlike anything in the periodic table. The material's strength-to-weight ratio exceeded theoretical maximums by orders of magnitude. Most puzzling of all, the debris seemed to retain properties that suggested it had once been part of a larger, integrated system, as if each fragment remembered its original purpose. "Any theories?" asked Colonel James Morrison, the project director. Dr. Chen looked up from her microscope, rubbing her tired eyes. She'd been working 18-hour days for a week, trying to decode the mysteries contained in a few pounds of metallic wreckage. "It's manufactured," she said finally. "Definitely artificial. But the manufacturing techniques are centuries ahead of anything we can accomplish. Maybe millennia." Morrison nodded grimly. He'd been hoping for a more conventional explanation, something that could be reverse-engineered and integrated into American weapons systems. Instead, they seemed to be dealing with technology so advanced that it might as well have been magic. "What about the symbols Major Marcel reported seeing? Present on several fragments, they appear to be some kind of information storage system, but we can't decode them. The arrangement suggests mathematical or linguistic patterns, but nothing that corresponds to human communication methods." Morrison walked to the window of the underground laboratory, though it looked out only on a concrete wall. Above them, normal life continued. People drove to work, attended movies, worried about conventional problems like paying rent and finding love. None of them knew that in laboratories beneath their feet, evidence of an alien civilization was being studied by teams of scientists sworn to secrecy. "Recommendations, Doctor?" Dr. Chen considered her words carefully. In the world of classified research, recommendations had a way of becoming policy, and policy had a way of shaping history. "We continue the analysis, but we need to accept that this technology is beyond our current ability to understand, let alone replicate. It's like giving a microchip to Benjamin Franklin and expecting him to build a computer." That metaphor would appear in classified reports for decades, a shorthand for the technological gap between human civilization and whatever had crashed at Roswell. Back in New Mexico, life was settling into new patterns. The reporters had gone home, the military convoys had disappeared, and Roswell was returning to the comfortable anonymity of a small desert town. But seeds had been planted in the minds of witnesses, seeds that would grow into something larger than the truth itself. At the local diner, conversations took on new undercurrents. Ranchers who'd seen unusual lights in the sky began comparing notes. Bar patrons shared theories about government cover-ups and alien visitations. The official explanation satisfied most people, but there were always a few who suspected something more profound had occurred. Glenn Dennis, the young mortician at Ballard Funeral Home, found himself at the center of whispered speculation. On the day of the incident, he'd received an unusual call from the base, asking about small coffins and preservation techniques for bodies exposed to extreme conditions. He'd assumed it was routine planning for a potential aircraft accident. Now he wasn't so sure. The nurse who'd called him, a woman he'd known casually from the base hospital, had disappeared shortly after the incident, transferred suddenly to an undisclosed location, according to base personnel. Her departure felt less like a coincidence and more like another piece of a larger puzzle being systematically dismantled. As summer turned to autumn in 1947, The Roswell incident began its transformation from news story to legend. The witnesses carried their secrets like stones in their pockets, heavy reminders of extraordinary events they could never fully discuss. Mac Brazel returned to his routines of ranching and solitude. Major Marcel continued his intelligence work, though he found himself scanning the skies more often. Dr. Chen published papers on metallurgy that danced around the edges of her real discoveries. And in the vast New Mexico desert, the wind continued to blow across empty landscapes that had once hosted the most significant event in human history, an event that officially never happened. The desert remembers everything, but sometimes it's the only witness willing to tell the truth. Chapter 6. The Watchers and the Watch Time moves differently in classified worlds. What the outside world measures in decades, the Keepers of Secrets measure in layers of accumulated silence, each year adding another stratum of official denial to events that refuse to fade away. By 1950, the Roswell incident had been thoroughly buried beneath new priorities. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. The Cold War was intensifying. Communist forces were advancing in Korea. Alien debris in a hangar at Wright-Patterson seemed like a luxury the military could afford to ignore. But some luxuries have a way of demanding attention. Dr. Sarah Chen had been promoted twice since her initial analysis of the Roswell materials. Her official work involved developing new radar systems and electronic countermeasures. Her unofficial work continued in the sub-basement laboratories, where fragments of impossible technology waited patiently for human understanding to evolve. "The molecular bonds are still stable," she reported to the monthly oversight committee. "No degradation after 3 years of storage." General Harrison, who'd replaced Colonel Morrison as project director, nodded absently while reviewing classified reports from around the globe. Strange aircraft sightings were increasing exponentially. Military pilots were reporting encounters with objects that accelerated beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft, that changed direction in ways that should have destroyed any terrestrial occupants. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, are we dealing with multiple incidents or a single ongoing phenomenon?" Dr. Chen had been dreading this question for months. The evidence pointed toward conclusions that challenged everything she'd been trained to believe about humanity's place in the universe. "The debris fragments we recovered at Roswell show manufacturing signatures, microscopic tool marks, molecular arrangements that match materials from 7 subsequent incidents across the continental United States. We're not dealing with isolated crashes. We're dealing with systematic observation." The words hung in the air like an indictment of human assumptions about cosmic solitude. "Observation by whom, Doctor?" "Unknown parties with technology centuries in advance of our current capabilities. They appear to be conducting some kind of reconnaissance program, with particular interest in nuclear facilities and military installations. 300 miles south of Wright-Patterson, in the skies above Roswell Army Airfield, objects that didn't appear on radar were conducting exactly the kind of reconnaissance Dr. Chen had described. Captain William Anderson was flying a routine training mission when his instruments began malfunctioning. Compass spinning wildly, radio filling with static, altimeter readings that made no sense. Through his cockpit canopy, he could see his F-84 Thunderjet was functioning normally. Straight and level flight, engines operating within normal parameters, but his instruments suggested he was flying through some kind of electromagnetic anomaly. Then he saw them, 3 disc-shaped objects, maybe 30 feet in diameter, flying in perfect formation off his starboard wing. They moved with the fluid grace of dolphins swimming through air, their metallic surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Anderson keyed his radio, trying to report the sighting to base control. Nothing but static answered him. The objects paced his aircraft for nearly 10 minutes, close enough that he could see details of their construction. No visible propulsion systems, no exhaust trails. They simply existed in 3-dimensional space, as if gravity was optional. Then, in an instant, they were gone, not accelerating away like conventional aircraft, but simply absent, as if someone had switched off their existence like turning off a light bulb. Anderson's instruments immediately returned to normal. His radio crackled to life. Thunderjet 772, this is Roswell Tower. Please report your status. Anderson stared at the empty sky where the objects had been moments before. In his years of military flying, he'd been trained to report everything he observed with precision and honesty. But he'd also learned to recognize situations where honesty might be problematic. Roswell Tower 772, all systems normal, requesting permission to return to base. That night, Anderson sat in the officers' club nursing a whiskey and wondering if he was losing his mind. The rational part of his brain insisted he'd experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by instrument failure and disorientation. The pilot part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through combat missions over Europe, insisted he'd seen exactly what he thought he'd seen. 3 impossible aircraft displaying technology that rendered human flight capabilities obsolete. Anderson wasn't the only military pilot struggling with such encounters. Across the country, classified reports were accumulating in filing cabinets marked with security clearances that few possessed. Pilots, radar operators, and air traffic controllers were documenting phenomena that defied conventional explanation. But the most significant development wasn't happening in American skies. It was happening in the minds of the witnesses. Major Jesse Marcel had returned to routine intelligence duties at Roswell, but his perspective had been fundamentally altered by his brief encounter with debris from another world. He found himself studying flight patterns of conventional aircraft with new eyes, recognizing the primitive nature of human propulsion systems compared to what he'd briefly handled in Sheriff Wilcox's office. More importantly, he'd begun to notice things that others missed. Subtle changes in military protocol, new security classifications that seemed designed to isolate certain types of incidents, personnel transfers that removed potential witnesses from sensitive positions. The machinery of official secrecy was expanding, creating new categories of forbidden knowledge. Marcel wasn't alone in his observations. Across the military establishment, men and women who'd been exposed to evidence of advanced technology were finding themselves part of an unofficial network of watchers. They couldn't discuss their experiences openly, but they could recognize the signs of similar encounters in their colleagues. A knowing look when reports of unusual aircraft were filed. Careful questions about atmospheric phenomena that probed for deeper understanding. The shared burden of extraordinary knowledge that had no official outlet. Dr. Chen's work at Wright-Patterson had expanded beyond simple materials analysis. The debris fragments had been integrated into a broader research program studying what military planners euphemistically called unconventional aerial phenomena. The reality was more direct. They were trying to understand the capabilities and intentions of non-human intelligence. The surveillance pattern is becoming more sophisticated, she reported to General Harrison during their monthly briefing. Instead of random encounters, we're seeing coordinated observation of specific targets, nuclear weapons facilities, advanced research installations, major population centers, as if they're mapping our capabilities or assessing our readiness for something. The implications of Dr. Chen's analysis rippled through classified channels, reaching decision-makers who'd never seen the Roswell debris, but who understood its significance. In the highest levels of government, contingency plans were being developed for scenarios that had never before required consideration. First contact protocols, communication strategies for encounters with advanced non-human intelligence, military responses to technologies that rendered conventional weapons obsolete. America was preparing for a future that officially didn't exist. But in Roswell, New Mexico, that future felt increasingly present. Mac Brazel had kept his promise of silence, never speaking publicly about what he'd found scattered across his ranch. But isolation had given him time to observe and remember. The financial compensation from the military had allowed him to make improvements to his property, including better fencing and upgraded equipment. It had also given him time to notice patterns in the desert sky that he'd never paid attention to before. Lights that moved against the wind, aircraft that flew without sound, objects that appeared in photographs as metallic discs but were invisible to the naked eye at the time the pictures were taken. The desert was being watched, and Mac was beginning to understand that he'd been far more than a random witness to a single crash. He'd been the first human to discover physical evidence of an ongoing presence that stretched back years, possibly decades. Evidence that was now locked away in government facilities while the phenomenon it represented continued overhead, night after night. One evening in late autumn, as Mac sat on his porch watching the first stars emerge, he saw something that made him understand the true scope of what had begun on his ranch in July 1947. A formation of lights, 7 objects flying in perfect geometric precision, passed directly over his property at an altitude he estimated to be several thousand feet. They moved without sound, without visible propulsion, their arrangement suggesting intelligence and purpose. As they passed overhead, the lights seemed to pulse in sequence, as if acknowledging his presence below. Mac Brazel, who'd spent his life dealing with practical problems like cattle and weather and broken fences, found himself waving back at the impossible objects in the desert sky. It was a gesture of recognition between species separated by vast differences in technology and understanding, but connected by a single moment of contact that had changed both their worlds forever. Above him, the lights continued their silent journey toward the horizon, carrying with them mysteries that human civilization was only beginning to comprehend. The watchers and the watched, locked in a dance of observation and secrecy that would continue for decades. But the dance had begun in Roswell, on a summer night when lightning came in colors Mac Brazel had never seen before, and something fell from the heavens that would never be allowed to rise again. Not officially. Not in any way that could threaten the comfortable assumptions that kept human civilization stable and unaware of how vast and populated the universe really was. Chapter 7. The Keepers of Truth. December 1952. 5 years after Mac Brazel found debris scattered across his ranch, the United States Air Force established Project Blue Book, an official investigation into unidentified flying objects. The timing wasn't coincidental. Reports of unusual aerial phenomena had increased dramatically since Roswell. Military installations across the country were logging encounters with objects that displayed flight characteristics beyond known technology. Public interest was growing, fed by magazine articles, radio programs, and the persistent questions of reporters who sensed a larger story behind the official denials. Something had to be done to manage the narrative. Captain Edward Ruppelt arrived at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base on a cold morning when frost covered the runways like crystalline lace. Officially, he was there to head the Air Force's new UFO investigation unit. Unofficially, he was there to become the public face of controlled disclosure, revealing just enough truth to satisfy curiosity while protecting the deeper secrets that could destabilize society. Captain, General Samford briefed him in a conference room that overlooked the same hangars where Roswell debris still waited in climate-controlled storage. Your mission is to investigate UFO reports scientifically and objectively. The American people deserve answers based on facts, not speculation. Ruppelt nodded, though he detected layers of meaning beneath the general's words. Scientific and objective investigation, but within carefully defined parameters. Facts, but only facts that supported predetermined conclusions. What resources will be available for this investigation, sir? Everything you need to be thorough and credible. We want Project Blue Book to represent the gold standard of military investigation. What General Samford didn't mention was the basement laboratory where Dr. Sarah Chen continued her analysis of materials that would never be included in Blue Book's official findings. Some truths were too dangerous for scientific objectivity. As Captain Ruppelt settled into his new role, he quickly discovered that UFO investigation was unlike any other military assignment. Each case file contained multiple layers of reality, from the mundane explanations that satisfied most observers to the genuinely inexplicable encounters that defied conventional analysis. The Kenneth Arnold sighting near Mount Rainier, pilot Thomas Mantell's fatal pursuit of an unknown object over Kentucky, the Lubbock lights witnessed by hundreds of people across Texas. Each incident generated reports, investigations, and conclusions that seemed designed more to reassure than to illuminate. But it was the Roswell file that taught Ruppelt the true complexity of his assignment. Weather balloon, the official report stated. High-altitude radar reflector used for classified atmospheric research. The file was thin, containing only basic incident reports and the press release corrections that had ended media interest in July 1947. No photographs of the actual debris, no detailed analysis of the materials recovered, no interviews with Major Marcel or the other military personnel who'd handled the wreckage. For an investigation that was supposed to represent the gold standard of military thoroughness, the Roswell file was remarkably incomplete. Ruppelt's request for additional documentation was denied. The materials had been routinely destroyed after analysis, according to base records. The personnel involved had been reassigned to classified positions that made interviews impossible. The message was clear. Roswell was not a case Project Blue Book was expected to solve. 3 floors below Ruppelt's office, Dr. Chen was making discoveries that would have revolutionized human understanding of physics, materials science, and humanity's place in the universe. The debris fragments had yielded insights into propulsion systems that manipulated gravity itself, construction techniques that assembled materials at the molecular level, and information storage methods that encoded vast amounts of data in crystalline structures smaller than human cells. Each breakthrough raised more questions than it answered. The energy source remains a mystery. She reported to the Oversight Committee that met monthly in rooms that didn't officially exist. The fragments contain no recognizable fuel systems, no batteries, no conventional power generation equipment. Yet spectral analysis indicates they were part of systems that operated at energy levels far beyond our current capabilities. General Harrison had aged visibly during his years overseeing what staff members privately called the Roswell Project. The weight of unprecedented knowledge, combined with the impossibility of acting on that knowledge, had taken its toll. Doctor, in your professional opinion, how long before human technology reaches a level where we could begin to understand these systems? Dr. Chen considered the question carefully. It was one she'd been asking herself for 5 years, and the answer hadn't improved with time. Decades, sir. Possibly centuries. We're trying to reverse engineer technologies that may represent thousands of years of development beyond our current scientific foundation. Meanwhile, in the public sphere, Project Blue Book was fulfilling its mission of managed disclosure perfectly. Captain Ruppelt and his team investigated UFO reports with apparent thoroughness, applying scientific methodology to phenomena that often defied scientific explanation. Their findings satisfied most observers. 90% of UFO sightings could be attributed to conventional explanations like aircraft, weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, or simple misidentification of celestial objects. The remaining 10% were classified as unidentified, a category that suggested mystery without implying alien visitation. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic misdirection, giving the appearance of complete investigation, while protecting the most significant secrets in human history. But the secrets had a weight of their own, and that weight was beginning to affect the people who carried them. Major Marcel had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and transferred to a Pentagon assignment that kept him far from New Mexico and the memories buried in its desert soil. But Washington, D.C., offered its own reminders of extraordinary knowledge. In classified briefings about Soviet capabilities and emerging technologies, Marcel recognized the gap between official assessments and the reality he'd briefly glimpsed in Sheriff Wilcox's office. American scientists were racing to develop jet aircraft that could break the sound barrier. The materials from Roswell suggested propulsion systems that treated the sound barrier like a minor inconvenience. Technologies that could accelerate objects from 0 to thousands of miles per hour without creating sonic booms or generating heat signatures. The Cold War was being fought with primitive weapons compared to what lay dormant in classified storage. Marcel's new assignment involved analyzing intelligence reports from around the world, looking for signs of Soviet technological breakthroughs that might threaten American superiority. But increasingly, he found himself wondering if the real threat to human civilization wasn't the Soviets at all. It was the gradual realization that Earth was already occupied by intelligences far more advanced than either superpower could imagine. In New Mexico, Mac Brazel had become something of a local celebrity, though not in any way he'd intended. Visitors to Roswell occasionally sought him out, hoping to hear first-hand accounts of the famous weather balloon incident. Mac received them politely, offering coffee and declining to discuss anything beyond what had appeared in the official press releases. But the questions never stopped coming, and each inquiry reminded Mac of the weight he carried. The knowledge that human civilization was living in ignorance of realities that could transform everything from science to philosophy to humanity's understanding of its cosmic significance. Sometimes, sitting on his porch in the evening, Mac wondered if he'd made the right choice in accepting the military's compensation and silence. The money had improved his life materially, but it had also made him a keeper of secrets that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Above him, the desert sky continued its nightly display of stars and planets, and the occasional aircraft following conventional flight paths with conventional technologies. But Mac knew that other things moved through that sky as well, things that chose not to reveal themselves to a world that wasn't ready for the truth they represented. The keepers of truth, watching from above while the keepers of secrets worked below to maintain the illusion that humanity was alone in the universe. Both groups bound by knowledge that could change everything, both committed to protecting a civilization that might not survive the revelation of how small and young and vulnerable it really was. The dance between watchers and watched continued, night after night, while the desert remembered everything and said nothing. Chapter 8. The Long Echo. 60 years later, Roswell, New Mexico had become something its founders never could have imagined, the UFO capital of the world. Main Street bustled with alien-themed shops, restaurants shaped like flying saucers, and tour buses filled with visitors from around the globe. The International UFO Museum occupied the Old Plains Theater, where Mac Brazel might have watched westerns on Saturday nights, unaware that his ranch would someday become the most famous crash site in history. But the real story wasn't in the souvenir shops or the annual UFO festival that brought thousands of believers to the desert each summer. The real story was in the memories of old men who were running out of time. Jesse Marcel Jr. sat in his father's study, surrounded by boxes of documents and photographs that had never been intended for public viewing. His father had passed away in 1986, taking with him the burden of secrets he'd carried for nearly 4 decades. But before his death, he'd begun to speak. Quietly at first, then with growing urgency as he realized that history was being rewritten by those who hadn't been there. "Son," he'd said during one of their last conversations, "what I handled at Roswell wasn't from this world. I knew it then, and I know it now. Whatever they've said since, whatever explanations they've offered, I held pieces of a craft that came from somewhere else." Jesse Jr. opened a manila folder marked "Personal, not for publication" in his father's careful handwriting. Inside were dozens of sketches and notes, documenting details that had never appeared in any official report. Beam structures covered with symbols that looked like hieroglyphs, but followed patterns no human language had ever used. Metallic material that could be crumpled into a ball but would immediately return to its original shape when released. Fragments so light they seemed to defy gravity, yet impossible to break or bend. "I drew these from memory," his father had written in the margin of one sketch. "Every detail as accurate as I could make it. Someone needs to remember what we really found out there." 3,000 miles away, in a classified facility that had evolved far beyond the simple laboratories where Dr. Sarah Chen had begun her analysis decades earlier, teams of scientists were still studying materials that officially didn't exist. Dr. Michael Harrison, the general's son who'd followed his father into military science, reviewed progress reports that would have astounded the researchers of the 1950s. Advances in electron microscopy, molecular analysis, and quantum physics had revealed layers of complexity in the Roswell debris that earlier investigators could never have imagined. The construction techniques suggest manufacturing at the atomic level, he noted in his latest classified report. Each fragment appears to be assembled molecule by molecule, with precision that exceeds anything in our current technological capability by several orders of magnitude. But for all their advanced analysis, the fundamental mystery remained unchanged. The debris represented technology so far beyond human achievement that reverse engineering seemed impossible. It was like expecting a Bronze Age craftsman to build a computer by studying a microprocessor. The gap was simply too vast. Yet the materials continued to yield secrets. Quantum effects that shouldn't exist at macroscopic scales. Molecular bonds that remained stable under conditions that should have destroyed any known substance. Information storage systems that encoded data in crystalline structures using principles human science was only beginning to understand. We're not trying to reverse engineer this technology anymore, Dr. Harrison concluded in his report. We're trying to use it as a roadmap for scientific development over the next century. These materials are showing us what's possible, even if we can't yet understand how it's accomplished. In Roswell, the annual UFO festival was reaching its peak attendance. Thousands of visitors wandered through exhibits that mixed genuine historical documentation with speculation, entertainment, and outright fiction. Most came for the spectacle, the novelty of visiting the world's most famous UFO site. But scattered among the tourists were individuals with more serious intentions. Former military personnel who'd had their own encounters with inexplicable phenomena. Researchers who'd spent decades collecting testimonies from witnesses whose stories never appeared in official records. Scientists working at the edges of accepted physics, looking for clues that might bridge the gap between human knowledge and the technologies that had been briefly revealed at Roswell. They gathered in quiet corners of hotel lobbies, sharing information that couldn't be published in academic journals or government reports, building an unofficial archive of extraordinary events that suggested humanity was living in willful ignorance of realities that surrounded it. The Roswell incident wasn't an isolated event. Dr. Amanda Richardson told a small gathering of researchers in a conference room at the Holiday Inn. She'd spent 30 years analyzing radar data from military installations, looking for patterns in reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. It was the first time physical evidence was recovered, but the observation program had been going on for years before that, and it's continued ever since. Her charts and graphs showed a statistical pattern that was impossible to ignore. UFO sightings had increased dramatically following the development of nuclear weapons. Military bases with atomic arsenals reported encounters with unidentified craft at rates far above random chance. Nuclear facilities experienced equipment malfunctions and security breaches that coincided with radar signatures of objects displaying impossible flight characteristics. Whatever crashed at Roswell was part of a systematic reconnaissance effort, Dr. Richardson concluded. They've been studying our technological development, particularly our weapons capabilities. The question is, what are they planning to do with that information? Miles away from the festival crowds in a quiet neighborhood where retired military families lived in modest homes surrounded by desert landscaping, Colonel Philip Corso Jr. was sorting through his father's papers. Colonel Corso Sr. had served in Army intelligence, spending much of his career at the Pentagon in positions that gave him access to classified information about unconventional phenomena. Before his death, he'd written a controversial book claiming that technologies recovered from Roswell had been secretly integrated into American military development programs. Fiber optics, integrated circuits, Kevlar, night vision systems. According to Corso Sr., these breakthrough technologies hadn't emerged from normal research and development. They'd been reverse engineered from alien artifacts. Dad was very specific about this, Corso Jr. told a documentary filmmaker who'd come to interview him. He said the military had been feeding Roswell technology to defense contractors for decades, always disguising the true source, making it look like normal scientific breakthroughs when they were actually based on analysis of materials that came from somewhere else. The claims were impossible to verify through official channels. The companies allegedly involved denied any knowledge of alien technology. Government agencies refused to comment on classified programs that might or might not exist, but the timeline was suggestive. Many of the technological breakthroughs that had defined the late 20th century, the computer revolution, advanced materials science, quantum electronics, had emerged from military research programs during the exact period when Roswell debris was being analyzed in classified laboratories. Coincidence or consequence? The question had never been officially answered. As the sun set over Roswell on the final day of the UFO festival, visitors began their journeys home, carrying with them souvenirs and stories that would fuel conversations for months. Most would remember their visit as entertainment, a quirky detour into American mythology, but some would remember it differently, as a glimpse into suppressed history, a recognition that the universe was far stranger and more populated than official sources were willing to admit. In the New Mexico desert, where it all began, the wind continued to blow across landscapes that looked exactly as they had in July 1947. Mac Brazel's ranch had been sold years earlier, but the new owners occasionally found visitors with metal detectors, still hoping to discover fragments that the military recovery teams might have missed. They never found anything, of course. The cleanup had been thorough beyond any reasonable standard. But sometimes on clear nights when the sky was particularly brilliant with stars, people claimed to see lights moving in formation across the desert, silent, purposeful, following flight paths that suggested continued interest in what had happened here so many years ago. The watchers were still watching, the secret keepers were still keeping secrets. And somewhere in classified facilities that didn't appear on any public records, scientists continued to study fragments of impossible technology, hoping that human understanding would eventually evolve enough to bridge the gap between what we know and what we've found. The Roswell incident had ended in July 1947 with a press conference that explained away the most significant discovery in human history as a weather balloon. But its echo continued to reverberate through the decades, a frequency that only certain people could hear, carrying the persistent message that we are not alone in the universe. We have never been alone, and someday, when humanity is ready for the truth, the evidence will still be waiting in those classified storage rooms, preserved against the day when the world can handle the knowledge that everything changed in a New Mexico desert on a summer night, when the lightning came in colors Mac Brazel had never seen before. The desert remembers everything, even the things we've chosen to forget. In memory of all the witnesses who carried extraordinary secrets, and in honor of the truth that waits patiently for its moment of revelation,